Okay, good, good. All right, let's just jump in. We are so
Yeah.
sorry for the technical difficulty. I'm over here sweating a little bit. I'm glad it worked out. But thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today and for your patience and for your grace. I'm Chris Young. I serve as GC of Ironclad, and I'm here with my man, Vincent, who's another esteemed GC at UpGuard. And we're really excited today because we're going to talk about something that I think we're seeing more and more in the legal profession, and something that's absolutely expected of legal departments and GCs, which is running a data-driven organization, much like every other department and component within a company, whether it's marketing, sales, you name it. Every single component, when you sit at that executive table, has data, has numbers, has metrics that they're sharing, they're reporting against, and they're gauging their success against. And today I'm excited to have Vincent, someone who I consider a thought leader in this space, who's gone to significant lengths over probably the past several months, if not years, to come up with data from his Ironclad instance that can be shared with the executive team, but importantly can be used by him to determine how his own team is faring internally. So that dual purpose of here's how legal is doing and here's how we can help drive business. And then internally, how is the team doing? How are we doing in terms of workload? How are we doing in terms of load balancing? How quickly are we getting through work, etc.? So without further ado, I'd like to press pause here, welcome everyone, and turn it over to Vincent, who I'd love if you could just share some of your background, Vincent. Welcome, welcome, and thank you for participating today.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. My name is Vince. I'm currently general counsel at a company called UpGuard. We are a cybersecurity company. We help our customers understand their cybersecurity risk profile, and we also help our customers understand their vendors' customer cybersecurity risk profiles. Prior to being at UpGuard, I spent some time as a law clerk, some time at a big law firm. I was a co-founder at a B2B SaaS company. And right before joining UpGuard, I was AGC at Coursera, where I led our sales contracting team. And that's where a lot of these thoughts and ideas around metrics coalesced for me.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks for sharing that, Vincent. Again, it's good to be together. Let's just jump in the interest of time here. And so just folks, just so you know, in terms of what to expect for today, we've got this hour blocked off. But we're going to save probably 15, maybe even 20 minutes at the end for questions because we've had some submissions already. And I'm sure folks on the chat will be able to or be interested in logging questions that we can hopefully get to. So we're going to go through this. We're going to have a conversation. And at the end, we're all ears and we'd like to do what we can to answer whatever questions you have. So let's just jump in, Vincent. The role of GC, right?
Yeah.
It feels to me like there's sort of this renaissance period in-house counsel is going through right now, where we're going from sort of just being seen as a cost center to actually strategic business partners and actually helping advance the key metrics within the company. And I know you've done a lot of work on the sales side, and we have a lot to share today. But can you just share with me how you think the role of the GC or the GC generally in these companies has evolved beyond just being a lawyer?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think when the anecdote that I think about is when I was joining UpGuard, I remember going through the interview process, and one of the questions that the CEO asked me was, "Hey Vince, what are you measuring? How do I know you're doing a good job?" And I think implicitly, how do I know that it's worth it to have a legal department internally as opposed to me just farming it out to outside counsel? And one thing that he didn't ask me was, what are the legal risks that you see facing the company in the next 5 years? That wasn't the focus. It was more just how are you going to run a department and be a value add to the business? So I think that was one part of it, and that really stood out to me. And the other thing that I would point to is everything that I see now when we talk about legal is legal ops. I hear legal ops constantly. And I think that's a reflection of how the business and the market has realized that having a legal operations function is very important to legal departments because it helps enable legal departments to be value adds to the business. And so I think that is a good indicator that the role has been changing for well over a decade now.
And when you got that question from your now boss, how did you answer it at the time?
I was I felt very, very fortunate because I had been working on the blog post that's currently up on the Ironclad blog right now. I'd been working on that already, and so I had good things to point to just at my fingertips. And so I felt very fortunate, and it was just a very timely question. And luckily, I was well
It,
prepared in
it
that
worked.
situation. Yeah,
Yeah,
it worked.
it worked. Excellent. And so, um, data is everywhere. I shared a LinkedIn post recently promoting this event, basically saying that we need data. It's critical, just like for every other function. And without it, we're flying blind. But there's so much data, so many different types of data. There's contract metadata,
Yep.
sort of the data that exists within the four corners of the contract. There's contract processing data that shows sort of how the life cycle has taken place at your organization, what's taken what amount of time, who's holding the
Yep.
ball, who needs to advance something in order for the deal to be closed. You know, what are some of the you think are sort of the essential metrics that legal teams should be looking at in order to help drive the business?
Yeah, so we have, I think, four that we're going to plan on covering off today. There's a lot more that you can find online. And just as a quick overview, the four that I want to touch on today are what I call just count. So getting a quick understanding of the very basic numbers. The second one is what does legal touch? The third one is how much work is each deal? And the fourth one is trying to tie what you do to revenue. We'll dig deeper into each one as we go along.
Awesome, awesome. And so, how can metrics help GCs make sort of informed decisions? And not only informed decisions, right? But also sort of gauge or measure the efficacy or even the efficiency of their teams.
Yeah, I think so. Metrics is a way that you can provide body and context to the discussions that you're having with your various stakeholders, right? So if you're talking upwards to your executive team or to the CEO, you want to be able to provide information about how you're providing value with respect to revenue. If you're talking cross-functionally, right, to your cross-functional stakeholders like your sales team or your marketing team, you want to maybe focus more on the efficiency pieces, the operational pieces. Hey, sales team, if you can help us do X, this metric will move and that will reflect our ability to get deals done faster. And then when you're working with your team, I think metrics are very valuable to show that we are working really hard, or the great ideas that you have around what we can do to be more efficient or more effective when negotiating deals. Well, that is actually showing up in the numbers, and that the contributions that you're making is in fact moving the needle, and we can point to that, quarter over quarter.
I appreciate that. I reflect back to 6 years ago when I joined Ironclad, and immediately when I joined, it was a small company, in an apartment.
Yeah.
Even at that time, our CEO Jason Bamig said to me, "We run on a company plan, and what feeds into that company plan are team plans. And so we're going to need your team plan." And of course, I was a team of one at the time.
Yeah.
But the team plan, right, was supposed to be modeled off of other team plans. And so it was full of metrics, full of numbers. And I kind of scratched my head because at that point, it was sort of more common than not within, I think, the in-house legal industry or profession generally you don't track metrics, right?
No.
That's not what we do. So much of what we do is hard to track. It's hard
Yep.
to assign value to what we do. But as time has gone on and as other technologies, even beyond Ironclad, that have kind of come to the fore and are being leveraged by legal departments, it turns out there's a lot of data that we have access to, and it's rich data. But I think the question I have for you is, what are some of the challenges you faced with actually tracking this type of data, and how have you approached those challenges or ultimately overcome those challenges?
Yeah, I think one just very fundamental challenge is prior to CLMs like Ironclad existing, it was very time consuming to punch things into an Excel sheet to track when a deal came in or when you sent out the next draft. And so it was a labor intensive process just to get that data close to being used. But because we have systems now where when you start a workflow, that is time stamped. When you touch a workflow, it is time stamped. When you upload a new version, it keeps track of those version counts. you kind of have those ready to go. And so you no longer have to spend that time generating that data. It's there for you to start processing. So that's one piece of it. And I think another hard part is even once you have that contract data or that legal data, in order to reflect that value and tell that story, you do also need to pull in data from other sources, whether that's your CRM, whether in order to figure out revenue numbers, whether that's your people system in order to track your FTE counts and your FTE costs. You start having to bridge multiple systems in order to tell that story, and that can be a big barrier as well.
Um, and it sounds like you've overcome that quite well, and hopefully will inspire others on this webinar and those who are tuning in the future, if it is recorded, to do the same, to think about the same. So let's just kind of jump into the meat of the conversation here. First, I'd like to point out, and perhaps it'll be shared in chat, but you wrote an incredible article. It's rich with guidance, with insights, and really with a how-to that folks should, if you're on this call, take a look at it, skim it, read it, learn from it. And so Michelle just entered it in the chat. Click on it, save it, and come back to it. Hopefully we still have your attention here, but I promise you it's a great read. But on this article, it really talks about different types of metrics you're tracking, Vincent. And so you mentioned the 4 that you're going to share with the audience. Maybe we can just start walking through what those 4 are and what each of them means and how you've gone about thinking about those metrics, not only thinking about it, but establishing them, furthering them, and sharing them.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start off with the first one, which I refer to as just count. This is one that is not reflected in the article that Michelle shared. This is a very basic one and a very simple one, but also a super effective and one that you should definitely start tracking. This one is generally around taking a look at all the things that you work on and just counting them, whether that's counting the number of MSAs that you do, the number of NDAs that you do, and keeping track of those and keeping track of them on a weekly basis, monthly basis, quarterly basis. And then over time, being able to expand that into counting them based on a person basis over a rolling 7-day, 14-day, 30-day period. This is a sort of metric that you can do without a CLM. You could be a one-person team with a spreadsheet, and it is worth doing because it's really fundamental and important. And you can get a lot of really useful information out of it, like what your general workload looks like. If you track over time, it can tell you how things are changing. It can tell you whether there's something suddenly different about this particular week or month that you're in. And so it's a very fundamental metric that is kind of the building block that you use to layer on a lot of the other metrics.
And it sounds like it's a good internal sort of like legal team metric for you as chief to kind of see how your team is faring. How else are you using sort of the count metric?
Yeah, no, I think to your point, I think understanding how your team is faring is a really fundamental part of the job, right? It lets you assess how everyone's workload is. It makes it easier for you to reassign things and move things around. And I think from that, for your team perspective, for that type of conversation, this is a really good one to pair up with the how are you feeling this week? How does workload feel discussion? And it makes it so that you can just manage your team and be a much more supportive leader.
Do you find yourself using it outside of the team? Here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking sort of an age-old issue with in-house counsel is demonstrating value.
Absolutely.
Right? And oftentimes, particularly during these macroeconomic times, we're looking for efficiency. Every company is looking to gain efficiencies. And so every team is being looked at very closely to determine whether or not the extent to which all the members of that team are contributing meaningfully to the important parts of the organization. And so is this something that you're able to have conversations with a CFO or a COO about when you're thinking about planning next year? Hey, our team is this number, but over time, the amount of work that's increasing over time.
Absolutely. So we'll tie into this one once we get to the tying to revenue piece. Actually, why don't we just kind of tie these two together?
Yeah, let's do that.
The last metric that we're going to touch on is what I refer to as the tying to revenue piece. And the idea here is you try and take something like your contracting FTEs or your dollar spend on your team and compare that to the amount of ACV or ARR that your company is generating, and just trying to track that and seeing how efficient you are. How much does each dollar of revenue costs from a legal perspective. And you can kind of do the same thing. You can say, look, if I want to generate this much revenue, how much work is my team going to have to do? And is that a reasonable amount of work as I look across my team? If currently we can sustain 30 units of work per month, and in order to hit this amount of revenue, we expect to need 70 units of work per month. One thing that we can do is we can certainly try and be more efficient, but then we can also, we will probably have to use that to justify more hiring, to say, hey, no matter how efficient we get, we're going to cap out here, and we're going to need more help.
Right, right. And so that's time to revenue.
That's time to yeah. That does touch on time to revenue, but I think this one is tying to revenue. Like, how do you tie?
Got it.
Yeah,
Time to revenue. Yes.
exactly.
Well, let's move in from just count to sort of the next of the four metrics that we're highlighting on today's call. What's the next one?
Yeah, the next one is what I refer to as what does legal touch? And broadly speaking, it's this idea that in the sales context, at least, a deal comes in and you want to get that deal from intake to close. Well, does legal need to get involved, and how much does legal need to get involved? In a perfect world, you can close all of your sales deals without legal ever having to touch a contract, right? That is 100% efficiency on legal's part. But getting a sense of like what proportion of deals legal actually has to get involved in, and in how much, lets you look at a lot of your processes, a lot of those process efficiency levers that you can pull on. Maybe it's the case that a lot of things that legal ends up touching is jurisdiction related. So for whatever reason, we always have to negotiate jurisdiction. Maybe it's a case then that you find a way to say to the sales team, look, we're happy to accept New York instead of Delaware. And so if that's the only request that you have, feel free to make that change on your own, and it never has to make it to legal. And so then you can move the needle in that way. Or it's the case that you find that every single deal that comes in, the buyer's unhappy with an automatic renewal clause you have in your MSA, right? And maybe you're willing to give on that 100% of the time. And so if you know that, you can say, and if you're tracking this metric and trying to understand, well, what things am I touching and how much, you can then say, well, maybe I'll just change that language and never have to deal with this particular red line again. And so having that type of visibility and tracking allows you to find opportunities, to find efficiencies in the process that you have.
It reminds me of sort of the past 2 years. I've had a very strange, well, not strange, but different legal metrics for our legal team.
Yep.
And really what we track in part is legal's involvement in just about anything. And what we aim for by the end of the year is to reduce legal involvement by X%. And so you can imagine, the eyes and the ears of the legal team when I came in 2 years ago and I said, hey, team, our goal this year is to significantly reduce what we're involved in. And of course, people at first were like, wait, what? This is our job. How are you trying to take our... No, but the reality is when legal moves fast, the business moves fast. And legal can help the business move fast by stepping aside and relying on SOPs, relying on your Ironclad deployment, relying on policies to allow the business to move as quickly as it possibly can without legal being there, involved, potentially slowing things down, but not actually sacrificing or entering into undue risk at the same time. So it's risk management plus the ability for the business to move quickly by extracting legal from, say, a particular type of contract, renewals, sales agreements, etc. Let's move into the next metric that you're tracking beyond legal time.
Yep. And then, so the next one is broadly, how much work is each deal? And there's, I think, a lot of different ways to track this. The one that we can talk about here is what I refer to as just looking at the number of drafts that it takes to close each deal. If you were to go into your Ironclad instance right now, take a look at any workflow that you might have worked on with your sales team and just look at it and say, how many versions were there of the MSA? And then you can take that information and then look at it across all of your workflows, say, for that quarter. And you can get a really good sense for just how many you can see a really good pattern, say for some deals will close really quickly. You'll get a bucket around like the 2 or 3 versions will be enough to close a deal. And then you can see another bump around maybe 5 to 7, and then another bump somewhere down like at 10. And those are probably your really big complex deals. And I think this is a very valuable one because it does give you an opportunity to go into those deals and say, well, is there anything that I can do to take the bucket of deals that takes 5 drafts and kind of move that down? What is it that we're negotiating? What is the slowdown? And again, very similar to the What Does Legal Touch one, find opportunities to build SOPs, to have better playbooks, and maybe give more enablement to your sales team to take certain things out of that process.
Excellent. And what about this 4th metric?
That one was a tying to revenue one. And right. I think that one was a tying to revenue one. And I think there was a question that was submitted beforehand, which is, what do you think is the most important one to share with your executive team? And I think it's this one, or a version of this one, because this is the one where you can directly tie the outputs of your team to the outputs of the company. At the end of the day, the CEO cares about how much revenue is growing and how efficiently it is growing. And so this is that metric that the legal team can present to say, at least on the B2B SaaS side, this is how much revenue we're generating, and this is how much each dollar of that revenue compares to the dollar input of the legal team.
So we've covered the 4, but I kind of want to step back and sort of, how are you packaging and presenting these metrics, and how often, on what cadence, and with whom?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. I think there's a lot of different ways, and I think they are all good. For me personally, right now, I'm about a year in here, and it's been a slow build into how you present them. And so every week, the legal team or every single team across the company will actually provide a weekly update on what the team has been working on, how it's progressing against its goals. And within that particular update, I currently report on the number of workflows that we've done across NDA sales, so on and so forth. And it's within that little report. I think once you get bigger, I think that format will probably change and it might get more formal. You might put together a presentation that has much bigger slides and graphs and charts to kind of show that progression as well. But currently, the way that I do it is on a weekly basis with fairly simple metrics at this moment.
And over this first year or so, are you working to establish a baseline on various different metrics? Yeah. You can show time how you're improving against what was true in the past?
Yeah, no, it's funny that you asked that, because for a while I had just been presenting them like this week is 5, and then next week it would just say this week is 6. But I realized that when you're reading it in that specific context on that particular day, for that particular report, there was no context for how it was tracking over time. And so literally 3 weeks ago, I started adding like, this is what it was last week. And then a week later, this is what it was like the last 2 weeks. So I've been slowly building out that benchmark. So now when you look at today's report, you'll be able to see tracking and how it's changed over the past 4 weeks.
Interesting. Going to, probably the first metric, just count. It makes me think of something that we've experimented with on our legal team at Ironclad. We obviously are power users of our own product, and we're often able to beta test, if not alpha, any sort of new feature functionality. But we're also able to get creative with the platform. And while it is a contract lifecycle management platform, and the focus really is on contracts, there's also a neat use case where you can use Ironclad for legal intake. And so everyone is going to the same place to submit their question. And we've configured it such that at the end of each month, I get a report from our head of legal operations that shows where the requests have come from, how many requests have come in. And ultimately, you're sort of over time going to create one-to-many resources that allow folks to answer their own questions. So we'll drive down the amount of time it takes for legal to respond to these questions. We've established an SLA so folks know how much time we're promising them that we'll get back to them in. And it's just another way to kind of demonstrate, when you think about legal touch, not just how how deeply legal is involved in contracting, but also the stuff that no one ever knows about, what legal is working on,
Exactly.
across the organization. Everyone thinks their question is the only question, but everyone, is 20, 30 people a month, right? And that's significant time. So
Exactly.
being able to track that as well, not only for internal purposes, but also when you're having these conversations about resourcing legal and compliance, it's really helpful to be able to have that data. Do you have any sort of war stories or any? I mean, it sounds like you started thinking about this at Coursera, right? And then you've kind of come over here to sort of implement it at UpGuard. Do you have any stories of meeting with different stakeholders outside of legal and having them be surprised pleasantly, or maybe unpleasantly, but surprised nonetheless that the type of data that you're bringing to the fore and you're discussing?
Yeah. So actually, before I answer that one, you had just mentioned using Ironclad as an intake system, and there's a question in chat right now about metrics for developing new products / advisory from Nita, and I was wondering whether you could provide any more color or context about how Ironclad might be using Ironclad for tracking intake on those sorts of advisory questions, like, "Hey, we're launching a new product. Can you help us with the marketing copy and this privacy review?" Does that also go through Ironclad for you?
It does. It does. Um, we make sure, let's step back. The time of each member of our team is insanely valuable. Legal is often the smallest, the leanest component within an organization. So it's our job to make sure that our folks are working, but not overworking, and that we are actually representing our client base well and keeping our promises. And so we have one place that everyone goes. A Slack will come in. Hey, can you help me with this? We're going to launch this AI feature next week. This is a true story, like relatively
Yep.
recently. We're going to launch this AI feature in the next, couple months at the time. And we'd love someone to come and check out X, Y, and Z and help us think through how we can make sure that this is successful, not only from a user standpoint, from a legal and compliance standpoint. So that came in through Slack from a senior executive on our team. And our team politely responded, "Hey, can you send it through legal intake?" And we share the link. And of course, they go in and they share the information and they ask the questions. And in that workflow, they see how much time it's going to take for us to get back to them. So we can set those expectations. And then we do the hard work of getting together as a team, usually weekly, going through some of the tougher questions that have been asked, and then ensuring that the right person has been assigned to answer those questions, track them down. And then we close the loop with a written sort of an artifact that's produced from Ironclad that gives the answer, but also there can be follow-up meetings, to ensure that we're moving in the right direction. So yes, we do use it for really all of the above, because what I see as a GC is, yes, it is incredibly visible, the work that you're doing around sales side agreements, revenue. But it's also really important to track the work that you're doing around spend, procurement,
Right.
which, right, like our CFO wants to know that. Our COO wants to know. Folks want to know, and we want to be able to drive down costs and make sure we're efficient in that way. But then there's this, that's still just contracting is the tip of the iceberg, right? For the
Yep.
legal team. Below the surface, there's so much more that teams are doing. And I thought that it was important that we, I think, not necessarily market and promote what we do internally, but kind of. I mean, we've got to be marketing
Yeah.
our team internally. We've got to be sharing with the different stakeholders the value that we're adding that they may never see and may never realize. And so that was really the thought behind creating this intake workflow. And because we have, in-app metrics, and we have an in-app sort of, charts and graphs you can produce, they're really neat presentation opportunities. So we have a quarterly business review at Ironclad, and we call it a quarterly legal review, where we go before our CFO and our CEO, and we can actually give a rundown of really how legal is working, and the type of services that we're providing. But for that data, it's very hard to make that compelling story. And so we've been really pleasantly
Absolutely.
surprised. It's taken a fair amount of time to set it up and to benchmark against it, but now we've been live for a year, and it's really folks really appreciate it.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think I will get to that question about war stories, but I do think that what you just described ties into another question that we had submitted earlier, which is,
Okay.
how do you get attorneys to get started on that mind shift of accepting metrics being applied to what they do? And what I would say is, I I don't think using metrics as a weapon against your team is a good thing, or is something that anyone wants to do. But
Right.
really tracking these things really makes it so much easier to illuminate just how hard everyone is working and like
Yeah.
what that output is, right? Your marketing team will have SQLs and like the number of phone calls that their SDRs did, and those get celebrated, right? But the number of times the legal team answers a question is also super valuable. And if you're able to have those metrics, have those numbers to say, we answered 55 product questions and we resolved 150 DSARs this
Right.
week, well, those are
Right.
real concrete numbers that you can then show to everyone. Look, this is the value that our team is driving. We're doing this so that, we don't run into, privacy regulator issues. And so I think that's the story and the narrative that I think you use to get your team members to understand that the metrics are a good thing because it shows just how valuable they are.
It highlights the work, and that's something that I believe every GC has got to do. Every legal leader's got to do is highlight the work of our teams. Otherwise,
Yeah.
it often goes unnoticed, and it's very important work. And as I've often said, in the past, it's really hard to prove a negative. It's hard to prove when you're talking about the value of a legal team that you added value because you made a certain move in the past that prevented us from from having problems, legal issues. It's really hard to prove a negative. So to be able to surface that data and say, hey, here's the things that we're doing, here's how busy we are, and here's how we're keeping our commitment to our clients. It's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
So, what do you think? Do you want to get into war stories, or should we move on to some of
Yeah.
the other pre-submitted questions, or some that have been asked in the chat?
Yeah, no, well, I'll share one story. It'll be fairly generic just so that I don't identify anyone. And I'm sure this is one that everyone in the audience has heard. We were at a team we were at a team meeting where we had invited a sales leader to that team, and we were going through the discussions, and we asked the sales leader, hey, what's something that you think legal can do better? And the topic of time to close came up, or time to close the deal came up, as it always does. And I think we hadn't yet shared any of the numbers with that sales leader. So I don't think that they were aware that we had those numbers, but they were going on and on about how things might be taking too long, and how legal was often the holdup. And he would hear from his sales team members that legal was the holdup. But it was very easy to just go into the numbers and say, hey, look, this is when something hit legal, right? This is
Yeah.
how long we were waiting for your sales team to go have a conversation about something. So that added another 7 days to the timeline. And then after we finished the draft, it turns out that we didn't have a deep understanding of the signature process. And so the sales team was chasing on the 3 different signers that they had to find. And that added another 2 weeks. And in fact, out of those 28 days, it was only in legal's hands for about 2 or 3, as it
Right.
very often is. So
Right.
being able to tell that story, I think, is was very gratifying.
I think so. Um,
Yeah.
it reminds me of so years ago we established a red line threshold at Ironclad where we said, look, if the deal is below a certain dollar amount, we're not touching the contract. And we had spent a couple years before then really studying, as you've seen through data, the friction points in our agreement and doing our best to bring it into market so that it became an
Right.
agreement that actually was fair on its face and really not necessarily unimpeachable, but close, right? And the idea was if we can come to the fore with something that's fair and balanced, then it should reduce the amount of time that we're involved, and
Right.
ultimately it should make for a good contract that requires no edits. And we really
Yeah.
took a data-driven approach to that. And so we met with our sales team at the time. This was years ago. And sales numbers, it's always stressful in sales. You've always got these bigger and bigger numbers to hit. And I remember going before our entire sales team and saying, hey, for the first time, we're going to establish a policy where we're going to establish a red line threshold. And folks, they
Yeah.
lost. They were like, wait, what? But what we had done beforehand is we had done a pilot for a quarter with a component within sales, testing this idea. And we were able to take data and demonstrate that we had qualitative and we had quantitative data. Qualitative data was kind of like getting quotes from customers and prospects, sort of basically saying our agreement's amazing. You guys have an amazingly fair agreement. Thank you for this. It made it so simple. So we took a bunch of quotes and we put it on a slide and told the sales team, folks like our agreement. It's fair. We've been working on it for a couple years. And then we were able to look at the numbers. And that's where we were able to show, hey, sales cycle decreases by X number of days when you adhere to this policy. So fast forward a couple quarters, got an inbound call from one of our sales leaders saying, hey, can we raise it a bit? Because my team is mostly selling deals between X and Y, and this would really help things move faster. And it has turned into something that's embraced, if not actually celebrated by the sales team. They can get through things so much faster when there's a fair and balanced, agreement that's really been stress tested over time. And so, anyway, another war story on our part, but that was kind of a fun process to go through and solution to be a part of, even at Ironclad. What do you think? Should we get to some of these questions?
Yeah, let's run through questions from the audience. We have a bunch of pre-submitted ones and ones from the audience live.
All right. Let's see. So this is interesting. One question is, do you have any financial metrics of performance other than cost savings, in-house or outside counsel spend, or savings through reductions of liability?
Yeah. So the way that I interpret this question is there something other that we want to measure that is not cost savings or reductions of liability? I will say that cost savings and reductions of liability have, at least in my mind, are very difficult to track because it's hard to know like what litigation you've managed to avoid. So if someone has good ways of tracking those, please let me know. I'd love to figure out how to do those. And I think a lot of the financial metrics here are going to be around one that we've already mentioned, which is how much does it cost to close each deal? And as you get bigger and bigger and more global, I think you can get a global number that says for every $100 of revenue, it costs $1 of legal FTE costs. And that is one, I think, very financial metric because it's your efficiency cost. And you can find different ways of moving that number. And it's also super valuable to track that on a region by region basis because deal sizes might be different region to region. Your cost per person is going to differ region to region. And so it's really useful to take a look at that from a global perspective as well. I think that's the main financial metric that I look at. Anything that you look at, Chris?
I think for the liability piece, I'm a recovering trial lawyer litigator. So I'm always thinking about like what goes wrong in the future. And, how do we prevent that from happening today? And one of the things I look at is just how, in your MSA, how you're sizing limitation of liability. And, as a company goes from a Series A company to say a Series E company, kind of like Ironclad's journey, obviously in the beginning, you're much more open to risk. You're just trying to get deals in, and you're not known in the market. People have questions about whether you'll even be around in the next few years. And so often counsel is demanding higher limitation of liability. And then you get a Series B and then a C, and then you start to tighten things up and become more conservative. And you start to change that over time. And what I've loved about Ironclad is we actually have our entire corpus of contracts, obviously within Ironclad, but we also track limitation of liability and deviations from our standard term and how the standard term has changed year over year. And that's pretty interesting to look at because you can continue to, as your company grows and as what you're building becomes more of a valuable asset, obviously your risk profile changes. And you can use Ironclad to track how you're managing risk, at the very least in your sales contracts over time. So we've found that to be pretty valuable and something that's of interest to our CFO, our CEO, and a few other folks on our executive team.
So quick clarifying question. Are you basically taking your entire corpus of sales contracts and then saying, tell me all of the limitation of liability clauses that I have across all of them. And then if everything goes wrong, if I have to litigate every single agreement, this is what my maximum liability is going to be. And then just tracking that over time?
It's sort of like that. I think in most cases, maximum liability will probably put most folks out of business. If everyone sues you for the maximum amount, then it's probably over, right? I think, and that's just not kind of, in my opinion, a realistic way to be looking at or sizing liability. especially when you're talking your insurance discussions. That's just not, you know, you look at other factors too. Are you storing highly confidential information, social security
Right.
numbers, and all the things that could really come back and get you? If that's the case, then you adjust accordingly and you protect yourself accordingly. Are you dealing with less sensitive data? There's a lot of different, elements that go into determining where you think you should land and what's market. But what we have done over time is we have a standard agreement that has our standard provisions and clauses, and we track how those have shifted or how they change each quarter, or how they're negotiated each quarter. What percentage of our contracts went beyond our standard, say, limitation of liability clause, and to what extent did they go beyond that?
Got it.
And then you can also look back. So if you're in the very beginning stages of a company, early stage, and you're trying to contract with a massive Fortune 10 company, and they say, yeah, here's our contract, take it or leave it. They're often going to demand unlimited liability, right? For things like data breaches and breaches of confidentiality, right? And so maybe you give on that as a Series A company. But when they're up for renewal 3 years later and you're a much more mature
Right.
company, you can go back and use data and say, nope, upon renewal, we need to actually switch that and change that and negotiate that point so that it falls more in line with how we're seeing risk today for the company and how we're seeing risk over the next 3 years, say, at the company. So that's what we do. We create a standard agreement, and then we determine the extent to which there are deviations from that agreement. And then we can look back over time upon renewal and make sure that we're bringing our old contract into a risk profile that's more appropriate for the company today. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Thank you. Um, we can take a look at the most highly voted question in our
Oh,
live
yeah.
Q&A, which is how do you track in a metric sense each team member's productivity? And I'll take a pass at this one first. What I do and have historically done is I'll go into Ironclad and I'll run two reports or two types of reports per person. One is how many workflows they have active within the past, say, 7 days or 14 days. And then the other kind of report is how many they've been assigned over a certain period of time. And the idea is if you're able to get a sense of how many active things they have going on, it gives a sense of what the workload looks like. And if you get a sense of how many things have been assigned over a certain period, you're able to project out into the future kind of what their workload might look like and what has been assigned to them. It's probably less valuable when you have like just one person or just two people, or no, just one person. But the moment you get to two people or three or four or a wider team, then it starts being, I think, important to get a sense for how that work is distributed among the team, and things like knowing how many gets assigned today or over the course of a quarter makes it so that you can kind of predict out, well, how busy is this person going to be on the line? And I know that the word that you used was productivity, and mine is slightly different, which is workload. But I think for the sake of focusing more on the inputs that you're giving your team member as opposed to like how efficient they are, I think might be a better way to start. Chris?
Well said. I was just thinking about a recent example where a member of our team went out on parental leave,
Exactly.
and so kind of with a relatively small team, you're talking about 15-20% of your team is now
Yep.
away for a while. And so what we were able to do was obviously look at Ironclad and check out the workload of each of the members of our commercial team, and we were able to couple that with the percentage of intake legal requests that aren't related to contracts through the legal intake system I mentioned earlier, to determine what percentage of those questions are being answered by a particular member of the team. And then you just do load balancing. Hey, we're going to decrease you from 33% down to 15% on legal intake. We're going to scale you up to 40% on commercial contracts. You could really start to move players around. And then if there is a situation where you need to adjust an SLA, say on the non-commercial front, you can convey that to your clients. Hey, we're a little stretched. SLA's increased by a couple business days, and here's how we're going to handle things. Stack ranking, prioritizing what's so key to the business that if it doesn't happen today, we can be in trouble, versus questions that can be answered, over time, right? And so that's kind of how we handle it, at Ironclad. It's been successful so far. We've been able to do pretty incredible things with a lean team, with life circumstances happening to folks throughout the past several years, obviously.
Yeah. And on that point, like when you have a new team member coming back from parental leave, having those metrics are also super important because you can then help them come back to work very effectively, right? You can say, look, we want to make sure that you have the right amount of things coming back onto your plate because you don't want everything to just come on immediately. And you also don't want too little things to come on immediately. And so having that visibility, I think, is a very effective tool to make sure that your team member is re-engaging as they come
And
back.
and Vincent, it's not only that. I mean, lawyers, what we all have in common is that we work incredibly hard. Like,
Right.
and there's just not enough hours in the day and way too much work to handle. And so it's not just like parental leave or life circumstances. It's also PTO, like
Yep.
vacation. Folks need a
Yeah.
break, they need a breather. In order to get the most from your team, you got to make sure they're feeling good as a whole human being. And so, what we love about Ironclad is that we can easily assign mid workflow. There's been a bunch of work that's happened on a key contract. But the person who's been driving that on the legal team is going off to Hawaii for 3 weeks and needs to be left alone. We can easily
Mm-hmm.
assign that to another teammate and they can pick up where she left off instead of having to go recreate the wheel and do a bunch of research, studying, and learn who the parties are and reach out and ask questions. Everything is captured there. So it allows for just smooth continuity during times when people, need a break or have had a child or something else has come up that requires them to be away. I find that, it's not just for efficiency purposes. It's not just for the metrics that we're tracking and we're showing. It's also good for the health and the well-being of
Exactly.
legal
I agree
teammates.
entirely. Agree
Yeah.
entirely. All right,
Jacqueline's
where should
got
we go next?
Jacqueline's got a question here about leveraging insights. How are you mining data? I'm not sure we want to use that word mining, but how are we leveraging data? And how are we leveraging multi softwares? I'm happy to share a little bit about that, but Vincent, I want to open up to you if you want to go first.
Yeah, happy to go first. So when I think this might tie in also to Richard's question below, which is it is difficult to pull things in together. And I'll be honest, what I ended up doing was either pulling everything manually into Excel or figuring out a way to write Python scripts to pull that data together to generate those reports. I don't know that I've seen a simple way to collect all of that data into one system. I think in theory, you could use things like Tableau or another business intelligence software that your company might have, like Looker. But I think it's still a fairly manual process. I've not seen anything that can pull everything together.
Yeah, it is. Part of it will be manual, and another part of it will be through the use of APIs. We have a great suite of APIs, and Ironclad allows you to kind of plug in
Yep.
pre-existing systems and to port data in and out of those systems directly into Ironclad. And I think just for us, we're talking a lot today about sales side and making sure that we're moving as quickly as we can to bring in as much revenue as possible and not inviting additional risk. And one of the things that I'd be remiss not to highlight is our integration with Salesforce. It's absolutely critical, and it's just bilateral data sync. The systems talk to each other. There's consistency, there's cleanliness in data. It's reliable, and you can actually emerge with Ironclad being your single source of truth for just about everything related to a contract, which is neat. So I think part of it's manual, Jacqueline, as Vincent said, and part of it's through APIs and connecting with other systems. It looks like we've got Richard here. How do you pull in FTE and cost of the legal team into Ironclad reporting on these metrics? Interesting. Is it a manual process or through integration? I understand AR and ACV numbers can be pulled in via SFDC integration. Just hit on that, but curious about other data. Do you have any thoughts on that, Vincent?
Yeah, again, I think it's going to be a good amount of, you can use the Ironclad API to pull down data into Excel and then probably take a look at your HRIS and pull in people data from there, probably manually, most likely, because again, haven't seen one cohesive system that will pull in data in that way to run those reports for you.
Same. I feel the same way. One of the challenges that we face, and something I've been kind of trying to figure out, is how do we, without man, mandating billable hours, how do we track,
Yep.
right, the time we're spending on each contract? And there are ways to do that in Ironclad, but outside of like contracts, and just with the legal intake system I talked about earlier, a lot of that tracking is manual. And so, I'm trying to figure out how we can demonstrate that we are saving an incredible amount of money using our own system to process contracts, and getting clarity on that unit of work that should be counted and how to track it even
Yeah.
more precisely than we currently do is something I've been thinking a lot about, and a problem I've been trying to solve.
Yeah. I think on that point, it's very interesting. I like to think of legal teams as actually being very similar to engineering teams. And
Hmm.
your engineering teams will have Jira tickets and sprints and like atomic units of work that they're supposed to output.
Right.
And so I think there's something to be learned from those teams and how they measure and weight that work. I haven't figured out a very good way of doing it yet, but it is something that I think about.
I think we have time maybe for one more of these questions. You want to pick one,
Yep.
Vincent?
Yeah, this is one that I'd like to get your input on, Chris. It's from Sandra, which ironclad features have been helpful to monitor changes in clauses over time? And then in your limitation of liability example, how do you operationalize that? Do you run a report every quarter, look at the terms?
Yeah. The answer to the first question is, one of the things that I think is unique about Ironclad is that, we're not selling like an AI point solution. AI is all the rage right now. We're all kicking the tires on these different AI features and point solutions, but we actually have it embedded into the contracting process. So you can leverage AI to determine really what's in your contracts in Ironclad, and that's a pretty neat and simple way to do it in many respects. We have a smart import product, for instance, that allows you to pull certain parts of the contract, get visibility, and actually glean insights and see trends as it relates to certain clauses or provisions. What we do just in terms of how to operationalize this is this: you have your form contract, right? You've established it, you feel confident about it. Let's just call it version 1. You're a Series A company. You put that out there, you negotiate it for say 2 quarters. You then look back at those negotiations and try to find common friction points, like what are the most negotiated parts of this contract, and Ironclad helps you figure that out without doing a ton of manual work, right? Once you figure that out, you start to think, how can we smooth these areas out? How can we make them less objectionable, but at the same time prioritizing our key job, which is protecting our organizations? But a creative mind, and with some outside counsel help who've seen other companies do other things. I often encourage folks to leverage outside counsel, to have large portfolios of companies who are similarly situated to your company. You start to figure out ways to get to a more favorable or a less objectionable agreement. So let's just say now you're a Series B company with version 2 of your agreement. You go through the same process again. You finally get to a point where you have a contract that you think will take you for the next couple years. And at the end of each quarter, my head of legal operations comes to me, and among many other metrics that are shared and data points, we do have 2 slides on how the extent to which contracts have deviated from, gone outside of our standard, say, limitation of liability clause. You can track them, and really how much more they went outside of it, right? If we're putting a 3x multiple on your annual fees as a cap for special damages, how often did we go to 4? Did we go to 5? And you can track that and share that. And then over time, to further manage risk, you have that data you can look back on, and then you can think about how things should look moving forward. And you just adjust along the way. It's not something you do from day one. You are building this process, you are monitoring it over time, and you're making adjustments over time. And the cool thing is that it's all about the data that you're taking from the contracts that allow you to make these decisions. And you can actually get buy-in from other key stakeholders before you come out with a new agreement, whether it's your CRO or your CFO. So that's how we've done it. Hopefully that's helpful. Team and folks, thank you so much for joining. Again, apologies for the technical issues in the beginning. We lost a few minutes, but hopefully we were able to make it up. Thank you for joining. We really appreciate it. Vincent, thank you for joining me today. It was fantastic to not only get to know you over the course of our rehearsal, but today, but also learning what you're doing. This is one of those rare moments in our legal industry where things are changing quickly. There's no more exciting a time to be a part of a legal organization in a company that it is now. And hopefully you saw a little bit of that today, audience, where we're highlighting the metrics that can actually use to drive efficiency and to prove the value of the legal department to folks who may not have a great understanding of its value. All right. I think that's that.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.